Greetings and welcome back to room 303, AP English and the World of Ideas lectures. We're now in lecture 16. This one is John Kenneth Galbraith's The Position of Poverty. Put it in your notes right away. This actually comes from Galbraith's title, Affluent Society, which is a really important book in the history of economics, published first in 1958, and then the fourth edition revised in 1984, so it had a life. Now, just to remind, we're in Unit 3. We're working with the topic of wealth. We've already in Lecture 14 talked about Smith's Wealth of Nations, and in Lecture 15 Marx's Communist Manifesto, and we now turn to some notions of questions of poverty. Before we get there, though, let's remind ourselves of some assumptions. The first is, you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net, World of Ideas lectures 1 through 15, and of course that you've been involved in our learning theory now. That ability or that desire to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. Our annotative process, hey, remember, we're working with paragraph notes outlining at level 1, what does the text say, for each one of the paragraphs of this essay, as we have done for all the previous lectures and readings that we've been working with. Of course, we're also working at level 2. What does the text mean? Our big 5. What does this text say about epistemology, ontology, psychology, sociology, and of course theodicy at the end. And then as well, we're asking at level 3, how can I relate this information to other texts and to myself? We'll be paying attention here in Galbraith to the rhetorical information in 2b as well. And then finally, I'm hoping that you read this material on your own and then come to me to help you understand this information, although I'm aware that some of us are probably just utilizing this information through this video presentation instead of actually reading it. I would challenge you, especially with a text like Galbraith, to sit down and try and read it. It's pretty accessible stuff, unlike maybe, for example, Adam Smith's stuff or even Marx's stuff. Let's do some quick biography information. Dude, this is going to blow you away right away. He's born in 1908. He dies in 2006, which makes him, almost 100 years old this guy lived. So he got to see almost all of the 20th century. It's quite remarkable, right? He is born Canadian, but becomes an American citizen and remained an American citizen since 1937. He grew up on a farm in Ontario, Canada. Some have argued this helped to the Genesis effect, to kind of bring about his economic views, because he grew up agrarian. One or two of us growing in a small agrarian town know a thing or two about this. His first degree actually was in agricultural science. He became a professor of economics. He served at Harvard for many years. He helped several presidents. John F. Kennedy nominated him as ambassador to India and qualified him as the best ambassador he ever had. The Affluent Society, already mentioned, published first in 58. It's revised in 69, 76, and 84 as the final fourth edition. The analysis of America's economic ambitions is often understood as the Affluent Society. He's very concerned about the environment. He was one of those early on economists that pointed out, we got to start thinking about the environment as business grows, because those two things are somehow symbiotic in ways that certainly in the middle of the 20th century, nobody really completely yet understood. He's going to argue that there's two kinds of poverty in this essay. Case poverty is individual poverty, individual to an individual or a family unit. And then insular poverty, which is the poverty of a larger group of people. I'll just pick up on page 238 and just read what Jacobus has to say. Galbraith's analysis is perceptive, influential, and while little or no progress has been made in solving the problems of poverty since 1959, he assures us that there are steps that can be taken to help eradicate it. Such steps demand the nation's will, however, and he warns that the nation may lack the will. He also reasons that because the poor are a minority, few politicians make them a campaign issue. Actually, of course, he was wrong. Think about it. Kennedy in 60, Lyndon Johnson in 64, Carter in 76 made programs for the poor central among their governmental concerns. Because of the war in Vietnam and other governmental policies, however, the 60s and 70s were a time of staggering inflation, wiping out any of the advances the poor had made. The extent to which this is true is observable in income figures for 1959, which seems so low as to conjure up the last century rather than the mid-20th century or beyond, right? Now let's talk a little bit about the rhetoric of Galbraith. Again, just to remind, we're reading these essays not just for our knowledge of economics theory, for example, but to help us as writers become better in our compositional rhetorical approaches. I'm just going to look at the opening paragraph or two on page 239. Just read it with me. The most important rhetorical achievement of this piece is its style, so you want to write that down. This is an example of the elevated plain style, clear, direct, basically simple approach to language that only occasionally admits a somewhat learned vocabulary, as in the use of a very few words, such as opulent for rich, unremunerative and ineluctable. Most of the words that he uses are ordinary words. He breaks the essay into 6 carefully numbered sections, so you want to make sure that's part of your annotative approach. In this way, he highlights its basic structure, informs us he has clearly separated its elements into related groups so that he can speak directly to aspects of his subject rather than to the entire topic. This rhetorical technique of division contributes to clarity and confers a sense of authority on the writer. And then just to finish, Galbraith will rely on statistical information that the reader can examine if necessary. And of course, by virtue of this being an older essay, if you want to run to ground some of these statistics, you now have the ability to do that through, technologies like Google much easier, right? Let's now turn to the essay itself. I'm going to work with grouping of paragraphing here. I'll start with paragraphs 1 through 3. He begins with Alfred Marshall. Alfred Marshall, he says, suggested at the turn of the century that solving the problem of poverty is the central concern for economists. In modern America, however, the poor are considered more as a reason for economists to go on working than as an urgent national issue. Economic expansion has changed poverty since Marshall's time from a majority to a minority affliction. Notice for your notes that he will play, as in Galbraith, will play a similar game to Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence and the consideration of the historical precedent when in the course of human events it becomes necessary. Galbraith will begin his essay by kind of looking backwards to the beginning of the 20th century and recognizing poverty was considered to be one of the major concerns that would become one of the major concerns of the 20th century. Of course, now in the 21st century, we continue to ask the question about issues of poverty. Paragraphs 4 through 7. People with enough income to survive are still poor if they can't afford to eat, dress, live in a standard the community considers decent. Though this degradation is better understood now than formerly, poverty has not been eliminated. This is the point of paragraphs 4 through 7, right? By the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare Standards, 13.4 million American households were poor in 1959 and 24.4 million in 1972. By the way, you can do this kind of statistical analysis now unbelievably easy by just simply typing in what is the standard of living, the standards, for example, of those considered to be within the designator of poor, economically speaking, today. You could do that and immediately get that kind of statistical information, and of course it's a tragically large number, sad to say. Paragraphs 8 through 13 now. Well, let's go to work. Case poverty derives from an individual's inability to master his or her environment. Insular poverty exists throughout a community, creating a poor island, quote-unquote island, within the larger society. Case poverty is easily blamed on the sufferer's deficiencies and also presumably easily solved with charity. Insular poverty, however, is more widespread, harder to explain, and most common in rural and obviously urban slums. Though it is often characterized as geographic, no correlation in fact exists between the natural resources of an area and its residents' tendency toward poverty. Paragraphs 14 through 16. Poverty is disproportionately high among blacks, Hispanics, the old. Heads of poor households are very often female or unemployed. Race, which restricts mobility and thus access to jobs, clearly a contributing factor, Galbraith will argue. So are poor educational facilities, the disintegration of family life. Notice in paragraphs 14 through 16, he's identifying the different reasons for this notion of case poverty. A general rise in income, therefore, will not cure insular poverty or case poverty because the poor cannot share it. Paragraph 17 through 19, as poverty shifted, again back to thinking about statistics, as poverty shifted from a majority to a minority position, it became a less attractive issue to politicians. Again, this is obviously something that John Kennedy and others like Johnson tried to alleviate, no question. And obviously, any politician today running for president or any other position will often have to answer the question about issues of where wealth resides in the nation. Wealth redistribution, obviously, is a huge debate, and of course, the issues of poverty. Paragraphs 20 through 21. An affluent society that is also both compassionate, that's a huge word, so write it down, and rational. This will be one of Galbraith's genius observations. We have to find a way to balance the competitive notions with compassion and rationalism. An affluent society that is also both compassionate and rational would ensure a decent standard of income for all its members. Such a policy also would prevent parents from passing on poverty to their children. When the poor were a majority, guaranteeing a minimum income to all was unrealistic. Now, it is an essential first step in the attack on poverty. You might put it in your notes. Galbraith was one of those early thinkers that said that the minimum wage, the amount of money that you make when you go into a job, is hypercritical in thinking about issues of poverty and getting out of poverty. Paragraphs 22 through 24. If we continue to assume the only remedy for poverty is helping people to help themselves, we miss the chance to improve the living conditions and thus the future prospects of poor children. Those outside the insular poverty community need to invest in high-quality schools, health services, nutrition, and recreation for children whose parents cannot provide such necessities. In addition, plentiful, decent, low-cost housing, mass transit, place for safe environment, and health care would help poor people overcome the restraints imposed by their situation. At least this is the hypothesis that will be given to us by Galbraith. Case poverty, too, might be alleviated by such remedies. He finishes his essay, paragraphs 25 through 27, by pointing out the following. Though we search for social explanations of the urban ghetto, partly in hopes of avoiding a huge investment in the public sector, only money is likely to solve the problem. Allowing poor people to participate in the economic life of the larger community also would increase their productivity as well as the nation's. The survival of poverty in a country as affluent as the United States, he will finish, is a disgrace. Seems self-evident, of course, but nonetheless, this is one of his major points. All right, let's continue now and finish with our analysis at level 2 and 3. First, let's begin with the big 5 at level 2. What does this text say about epistemology? Well, I think it's pretty clear that Galbraith is arguing that the fallibilist position, epistemologically speaking, that is to say what we can know, is a whole lot better than the absolutist position. Although note, he does seem to make some absolutist position statements, especially at the end. Like, for example, a nation that doesn't take care of its poor is a nation that's doomed to fail. That's a pretty absolutist, epistemologically speaking. That's a pretty absolutist position to take. What does this text say about ontology? Well, this is fascinating because Galbraith will point out that by nature we are competitive, but we're also compassionate. So the obvious question is, how do you balance those two things? When we're competitive, we want everything we want for ourselves. When we're compassionate, we're concerned about those who don't have. How do you balance those two things, ontologically speaking? Galbraith says, we got to find a way. What does this text say about psychology and the individual mind? Security, the importance of security, and the lack of security and the fear and anxiety that that provides. Well, of course, for children, especially living in those kinds of environments, in many ways create serious psychological problems, which then lead us to our next big 5 comment, sociology. What does this say about the group? We've got to care about the least fortunate within our society, because that least fortunate can become for the rest of the nation a serious millstone around the neck, right? And so we got to take care of this issue, Galbraith will argue. Finally, what does this text say about theodicy and the suffering of the world, the evil and the suffering of the world? I think in large measure, he does argue that in large measure we bring it on ourselves, economically speaking, regularly by not sharing a common policy regarding those of the most disenfranchised, especially the children of the poor, who of course grow up to unfortunately perpetuate the cycle of poverty, often Galbraith will argue. All right, at level 2A, what are major messages here? Well, one is we got to see the value of all of our citizens, not just those of wealth and means. We obviously have to balance, as we said, that notion of the competitive nature that we innately seem to have for Galbraith, and compassion, caring for all. And I think it's fairly clear. One of the major messages here is, as well as a nation, we're only as strong as the weakest in our national fabric, economically speaking. That's a compelling idea. At 2b, the rhetoric, notice the simple, the direct style. This is a very easy essay for most students to read. They don't see it as that demanding on them because of the style. Very direct. At 3a in our other texts, well, we have to mention Plato's Republic, no question. In our lectures we've already done and given on that. Plato obviously was deeply concerned about issues of economics and the ways in which poverty could lead then to serious problems. Especially, remember, he said in Republic 8 that, and Republic 9, that republics that turn into democracies turn into unlicensed groups of people, and because there's license freedom to do anything you want, often the poor are the ones that are going to be most hurt by that. Think about what we've said from our studies of Adam Smith and Wealth of Nations already in this unit, and notice he rarely mentions the poor. He mentions more, of course, celebrating those who are willing to work hard and find their way to wealth. But then notice what we said already about Marx in Communist Manifesto, and how Marx, placing the poor in that proletariat class, upset at the bourgeoisie for, of course, not considering the poorer classes. Think about Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus as Stoic philosophers. Fascinating study. We've given lectures already at learnstrong.net on this as well. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man in the world, comes to a Stoic philosophy. Epictetus is a slave. Obviously, he knows about poverty. He comes to the same insights regarding that Stoic philosophy. That is to say, hard work will allow one to at least find some sense of freedom within that contribution to the society of hard work. We can debate whether that's a notion that still survives and works for today. What about the novels or the texts of fiction or essays? I'll throw two at you to think about. Swift's Modest Proposal comes to mind. What are you going to do with children that nobody seems to want? In this case, obviously, in Ireland. Or how about this one, To Kill a Mockingbird? There's a classic novel that will play around with notions of poverty and how one lives within poverty and how one is blind to how others are living within poverty. What is for you, just a 3A to finish now, what is for you the most powerful text you've ever seen regarding poverty? Okay? Like it demonstrated for you, it made you go, wow, I guess I hadn't thought about the fact that certain people in our society have to live within those kinds of conditions. What for you, can you write that one down? That immediately comes to mind. Finally, at 3B, how can we relate this stuff to ourselves? Do you think poverty is a problem? And I mean, some of you will say, well, it gets dark at night. Why are you asking such an obvious question? No, there are in fact people that say there will always be the poor, and therefore it's not really a problem. It's an inevitability. And because it's an inevitability, then I just need to make sure I'm not part of the group of that are labeled as the poor. I'm asking you, what are your thoughts on this? Is there a problem? And then, of course, if it is a problem, what can be done to resolve that problem? Okay. Is being poor, for example, just being about not having money? Or is it rather something philosophically more profound than that? How about this one? Do you think poverty is an excuse for laziness? Because one is poor, one is incapable of moving outside of a certain economic class, therefore one should have license to be lazy. Do you buy that notion? Or do you rather see it quite to the contrary? We'll turn in our next reading to Richard Wright, who will be commenting as well on this topic of economics as a national concern. And as young students, hopefully this reading and the readings within this section, this part 3, have challenged you to think a little bit more about money and economics and wealth, the importance of taking care of all of those within our society. Thank you.